Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and balance coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Bite Size Balance. I have a return guest today. My friend Jenn Salib-Huber is coming to us all the way from The Hague, across the ocean. Welcome, Jenn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm so glad to have you back, especially to talk about the topic that you were the person I wanted to have on today to talk about this topic. We're going to talk about why resolutions are a bad idea. We're going to talk about why diets always fail, and we're going to talk about, why it's really important to shift your perspective and mindset around your body image and weight and food and how you choose to nourish yourself. I think it's the perfect topic for January. So let me tell everybody a little bit about you, Jenn. You have been on this podcast before. If you didn't catch Jenn's earlier episode specifically on intuitive eating, I really recommend you go back and listen to that one. It was one of the first episodes, and it was a really great conversation. Jenn is an intuitive eating coach and a registered dietitian and naturopathic doctor. She's been practicing for over 16 years, and Jenn helps women navigate the physical and emotional changes that happen in perimenopause and menopause, including their search for food freedom and body confidence. Working from a health at every size approach, she teaches women to become intuitive eaters and build body confidence in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. Well-versed in the integrative treatment options available to women in midlife, she helps women come up with a treatment strategy that meets their unique needs for a better menopause. She strongly believes that women need to come together to normalize this experience and offers small online group programs to help women feel their best. So Jenn, if you wouldn't mind, why don't you go back and tell us your story about how you got to this place where you started exploring intuitive eating and that became a big part of your practice.
Yeah, I'd love to. So I'm on the verge of turning 44. And I think like most women my age who kind of grew up in the late 70s, early 80s through the 90s, we were very much immersed in diet culture. And we didn't really support teen girls, especially through the normal changes that, girls in puberty go through. So like most girls, when I was 12 years old, on the heels of puberty and all the changes that come with it, I went through some pretty big body changes. And, the experience, the memory that I shared with you on that first podcast was about ordering a bathing suit from the Sears catalog and trying it on, expecting it to fit because it was the same size that I had worn, in the previous year. And it didn't, not by a long shot, because all of a sudden I had breasts and hips and thighs and, all of those changes that are normal, body fat percentage doubles, sometimes even more than that in girls as they go through puberty. And just because the culture wasn't there to support those normal changes, I internalized it as something that I needed to change, that there was something wrong with me. And so I really kind of spent the next 20 years chasing that. And, through a variety of diets and disordered eating and eating disorders and, pursuing a degree in nutrition and another nutrition related profession, naturopathic medicine. While it was always about trying to help other people, it was always kind of with the undercurrent of, and how can this help me solve my weight concerns? So after about 25 years of that, after having 3 kids and entering perimenopause, when kind of the gloves come off, in terms of how our body self-regulates and the changes that we're going through, I kind of just hit this point of I have to do something different because what I'm doing isn't working, but it's also not working for the people that I was seeing in my practice, right? So, I see a lot of women in my practice and was seeing a lot of women in midlife, and people weren't coming to me for their first or second diet. They were coming to me for their 20th and their 30th. And it had been this cycle of on and off. And so I don't exactly remember how I was introduced to intuitive eating, but it definitely kind of clicked, 5 or 6 years ago. And so I really closed my practice to weight loss because after learning about intuitive eating, learning about the science of diets and why they don't work as a long-term solution, how they can be harmful to health, I really just felt like I needed to do something different personally, but I also needed more tools in my toolbox that were actually going to help women in the long term.
Yeah, thanks. And let's go back to what you just said, because I really wanted to talk about this. We touched on it briefly in the first episode that we did together, but I want to talk about the science behind why diets fail. First of all, remind everybody of the statistic, because I think it's really important that women understand the statistic around diets. You and I think say the same thing. If diets worked, you'd only need to do them once. So
That's right.
what's the statistic on the failure rate of diets?
So when you look at the data, we have good data that at 1 and 2 years out from starting a diet, they fail 90 to 95% of the time. And by fail, that means that people have regained the weight that they've lost and often more. The big problem with weight loss studies is that they're often too short. So they're, 9, 12 weeks, 6 months is a long study in the nutrition world. And so they're not following people long enough. So when you see a study that says diet XYZ, people lost 10 more percent, or 10 pounds more than the other group, chances are at 1 year, there would be no difference. And so there's a few reasons why why diets don't work. One is that our body size and shape is largely under genetic control, right? So, if we look at things like height, if we look at eye color, if we look at hair color, shoe size, all of those things we fully accept as being under genetic control. But we have been told that our weight is something that is really under our control. And there's only a small percentage of that that's probably true. So since our body size and shape is largely under genetic control, any changes to our environment, meaning our food intake, are resisted, right? So that homeostasis that our body is trying to achieve, helping us to stay in that kind of genetic set range, is resisted. And so our metabolism can actually slow down. We can have an increased interest in food. Our body will do something called fat overshooting once we start eating normally again, so that it actually stores more fat in preparation for the next famine. So we're physiologically hardwired to maintain homeostasis. And any changes in that are going to be difficult to maintain, and they're going to be uncomfortable. And since we're hardwired to avoid pain and seek pleasure, it's very difficult to maintain restriction in the long term.
Right. Yeah. And when we're talking about diets, Jen, I want to be clear on this point, because I think, as most of the people listening to this podcast probably know, but let me remind you, I have a background in food as well. So I'm a natural nutrition consultant. I did a certification in natural nutrition, and that was kind of where I started as a coach. That's actually how Jenn and I met. We used to work together when Jenn was a registered dietitian here in Halifax. And so I have spent a lot of time, just like Jenn has, talking to women about food and weight. And I too left weight loss. I left weight loss as an area that I used to coach in for exactly the same reasons. It became super clear to me that it was such a complicated topic, and the solution was not ever in a meal plan. And I stopped doing meal plans, and I stopped doing any coaching directly around weight loss. Although obviously many of my clients, I still support women in relation to food. I think food is one of the most important foundation practices when it comes to how well we are, how balanced we feel, including preventing burnout. So it's really critical to what I do. But what I don't do is support women directly with weight loss when the goal is weight loss for the sake of weight loss alone. So one of the things that I deal with all the time is questions around different programs. I'm putting that in air quotes, because what women like to do, and it's not our fault as women. This is 100% the construct of the commercial weight loss industry and media. But we tend to do is we separate out diets from programs, from kind of like health and wellness programs. And so a lot of these things, people come to me and say, well, what do you think about keto? What do you think about a keto program? What do you think about intermittent fasting? These are the two that I hear the most now. And there's this notion that these are somehow different from diets. Because I think people know me well enough now to know what I'm going to say if they come to me with, tell me that they're doing, some obviously commercial weight loss diet plan. So they'll try to come in through the back door with one of these programs. What are your thoughts on those types of things? And are there any other ones that you've been hearing from people that fall into the category of diet?
Oh, for sure. So first I want to back up just a tiny little bit and say that intuitive eating is not anti-weight loss. That is a really important thing for people to understand.
Mhm.
Intuitive eating does not support intentional weight loss in the pursuit of health. So it's a really big difference. If your body changes in whatever way as a result of adopting, and maintaining healthy habits that support your physical and mental and emotional health, great, right? But you can't transpose that to say, okay, I'm going to do habits XYZ, and my measure of success is going to be the number on the scale or how much the number can move, right?
Yeah. 100%.
So
Yeah.
and I use the analogy because sometimes it's really difficult and the wellness industry has really co-opted this, right? So, wellness diets, right? So things like Whole30, any of those other plans that claim not to be a diet, but are a diet, right? Because they're restricting and they're telling you not to have things. I like to use the analogy of Mars, right? Because a lot of times women are saying, well, I just can't separate that out, right? Like every time that I make a change in my diet, even if I want health to be the outcome, there's still this little voice in the back of my head that will say, oh, but wouldn't it be nice if, right? Or maybe this will be the solution. Maybe this will be the one that works. So I like to use the analogy of Mars. So if you have grown up on Earth, and of course this is an analogy, but you've grown up on Earth and you've spent your whole life seeing advertisements and people participating in programs and plans of how great it will be if you can just get to Mars, right? So do this thing, eat this food, don't eat this. Look at all these people who are already on Mars and look how happy they are and look at everything that they've achieved in their life. So you give up all kinds of things and you sacrifice so much of your time and energy in your life to spend it getting to Mars. And you get there and you realize that it's not hospitable to life. You realize that you can't maintain your joy there, that you have to give up all the things that you love just to be there, and you're no happier because now you have all of these other things taking up your time and energy just to maintain your status on Mars. It's the same thing with diet culture. So we've been told that if we just achieve this thin ideal, that we will have life and love and success and all of our problems will be solved. But it's always framed as this place that we can achieve, right? It's like this destination, and it's all about trying to get there, because no one talks about how when you get there, it doesn't solve any of your problems, and it often comes with more. So I really try and kind of frame that when I'm working with women and working in that intuitive eating framework, which is moving them away from the diet mentality, trying to get to that unconscious belief that the thin ideal is better, right? What is best is the body size and shape that you can maintain without having to micromanage every bite of food and be constantly thinking about food. So sorry, I rambled there a
No,
little
no,
bit.
that's great. That's fine. We'll come back to it. We've got this entire hour to chat, Jen. So there's lots we can cover. No, I think that's great because that actually ties in really nicely to the work that I do around cognitive dissonance, which is a huge piece of the model that I'm trained in with This Naked Mind that I use always in
Yeah.
relation to alcohol coaching with my alcohol and burnout clients, but also I use it in relation to food habits because it's such a key part of it. And you're exactly right. We have to dig down and see what are those beliefs that we hold. And sometimes they're not at the surface. So they really are
Yeah.
subconscious in terms of it's hard for people to articulate them. They don't realize what that driving belief is that is pulling them back time and time again to something that their rational brain is probably at some point starts telling them like this, it's not going to work. This is not good for you. You're not going to be happier if you do this, but they keep doing it. I think it's very, very similar in terms of what happens
Absolutely.
with alcohol. And a huge piece of that formation of that subconscious belief is based on the commercial weight loss industry and the information that we're constantly taking in, sometimes without any direct knowledge that that's happening. In fact, a lot of the time that's what's happening through advertising and everything that we see. Because if you think about it, the overwhelming bulk of what we hear about weight loss is that it's success, that it leads to success. We very rarely focus on the information that is out there that says, no, wait a second, this is actually total bullshit. It's not going to lead to success. And exactly the same thing happens around alcohol in terms of the media influence on what people believe
Yeah.
about alcohol and what it's going to add to their lives. You're going to be beautiful. You're going to be sexy. You're going to be so happy. You're going to be social. You're going to have all these friends. Your life is going to be amazing. You're going to be on a yacht, all of this stuff if you drink alcohol. And of course, there is information out there that's completely to the contrary, obviously, just like there is with weight loss.
Yeah.
But we focus on, if that confirmation bias comes in, and we look for the stuff that actually supports the thing we want to be true. And I'm
Yeah.
sure that happens equally with weight loss. So I think that's a really important point for you to raise, because what it also does is it lets you off the hook. If you're listening to this podcast and you're thinking to yourself, that's me. Like, I've done every diet in the book, which is usually when women come to me, they have done every diet in the book,
Yeah, same.
done everything they can find that is, quick fix, relatively inexpensive. Like, some of them have tried really expensive things too, but they've tried it all and they're ready to try something different. So they're at that point where they're exhausted by the cognitive dissonance and they're saying to themselves, clearly I have not got this right because this is not working for me. But they're also feeling like they're a complete failure, because they can't make it work. And I think that when we start to understand what's happening with the cognitive dissonance, and that all this information has been filed in your subconscious now for the last, 40, 50 years, it's been filed down there around, This does work. You will be beautiful and happy if you do this. And then you can't achieve that because it's just not possible. We're going to talk about why it doesn't work. Then I think the understanding that there's this cognitive dissonance where your subconscious is just completely disagreeing with your rational brain. Your rational brain's like, there's got to be a better way. This can't be right, and your subconscious is still sending messages that say, no, this works. This is how you do it. This is how you get happy. When you recognize that it's that cognitive dissonance, I think it takes you off. It lets you off the hook a little bit. It helps to relieve that guilt. It helps you to say, okay, wait a second, this isn't my fault.
Yeah. And the diet culture industry preys on that. So, the foundation of diet culture was initially the calorie in, calorie out equation. Mm-hmm. And then when lived experience taught people that wasn't true for a lot of people, right? There, are hundreds of people that I've worked with who have counted every bite of food that's gone into their mouth, rightly or wrongly. Well, always wrongly, but I just mean, and obviously the calorie in, calorie out equation doesn't hold true for every body shape and type. It maybe does for some bodies, but not all bodies. And we know that because there are people who can eat very differently and end up living in very different bodies. And so when we started to experience that kind of cognitive dissonance, that's when a lot of the wellness plans come in, right? It's like, well, you don't have to count calories. You just have to cut out all of these foods. And if you can believe, and if I can convince you, not me, diet culture, if I can convince you that these aren't good for you, that gluten is inherently bad, that dairy is inherently bad, that sugar is inherently bad, then you won't want it. But the failure of the logic there is that your brain knows that you've enjoyed those foods. And so, and it doesn't have a compelling reason like an allergy or a life-threatening outcome to decrease that desire, right? And so when you're trying to remove things for the sake of a food rule, because someone has told you that you should, but your brain and your body knows that you've experienced pleasure eating those foods, that you enjoy the taste, that they nourish you, you just can't do it, right? And you end up in this situation where the restriction is actually causing, the control is causing the compulsion. So now you not only feel guilty for wanting and liking these foods, you feel compelled to eat them. And, it really sets up this dynamic where women feel like there's something wrong with them. They feel like it's their fault. They've been, that's been reinforced by what they're reading. And they just don't see a way out of it because they have this really deep rooted belief that they need to meet this thin ideal in order to be healthy.
Yeah, and that is made, as you're talking, I'm thinking like that's made even more complicated by the fact that there is, in the case of food, and this is a little different, I think, from alcohol, there's also a lot of messaging coming up around, actually, maybe it's not so different from alcohol, but there's a lot of messaging coming up from their subconscious mind that actually is in contradiction with the whole stay on the diet information that your subconscious is sending you.
Yeah.
Because you also have all of these thoughts and beliefs coming up around things like food is love. I deserve this. It's a reward. It's a treat. I need this to cope. I need this to feel better. I need this to escape. So you have these messages coming up from your subconscious, basically saying, eat, eat, eat. And then you have messages coming up from your subconscious saying, whatever you do, don't put that food in your mouth.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I just kind of thought of that now. It's really interesting how you have these really mixed messages. In the case of alcohol, most people, when I start working with them, don't have a lot of messaging coming from their subconscious that's saying, don't drink. It's the
Yeah.
opposite. But with food, it's so complicated. There are so many layers happening in terms of, these messages that we have stored in our brains. And so what Jenn and I want you to know is that, first of all, this is totally normal. This happens to all women. I don't know, Jenn. Like, I've probably met 5 women that I can think of in the course of my entire lifetime, both my personal life and my professional life coaching, that don't have some mixed messaging around food that's causing them trouble with food. I think we all find ourselves in this place to different degrees. So it's totally normal, and it is 100% not your fault. And the last message that we both want to share with you is that there is something you can do about it. It doesn't need to be this way.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So just to clarify that earlier question, Jenn, when we're talking about diets, you made a really great point. You said, we have to be and that's really, I think, what I was talking about when I was talking about programs versus diets. So programs are more these wellness kind of advocated by the wellness industry, sold as kind of healthy approaches, and don't necessarily involve calorie counting or some of those measuring or some of those typical old school diet tools. And those programs might include things like Whole30, or for some people, vegetarianism or veganism can become that for people. So those programs, along with things like keto, which also sold for its health benefits, and intermittent fasting, also sold for its health benefits, those programs can fall into that category for you of a diet.
Always.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to clarify for people.
Yeah. And the thing is that if the food rules require you to restrict, it require you to follow a set of rules that are applied to a large group of people that don't take your individual needs and wants and goals into consideration, it's never going to work. Right. And so, back when I used to do meal plans, or people would ask me to do meal plans, and I stopped doing them, they'd say, well, why won't you just tell me what to eat? I just want someone to tell me what to eat. Like, tell me 21 meals during the week and I'll do it. That's all I need. But it's never what you need, because I don't know what you like, and I don't know what your life is like, and I don't know how much you like or don't like to cook. I don't know where you do your groceries. And so for me to try and impose my likes, or kind of my expectations of what you can and can't do and enjoy, that's never going to work. And that's the big problem with any health plan that claims it's for health, but is either using weight loss as a proxy for health, right? So all of these plans are like, oh, you'll feel great and you'll lose weight. They're still using weight loss as a proxy for health, right? And so you have to really kind of take the blinders off to those wellness programs to see that this is still what they're trying to sell. They may be telling you that it's about health, but they're selling weight loss.
Yeah.
Right.
And what's the role of because as you're talking, I'm thinking of things, which is how our podcasts go. I haven't asked you any of the questions I planned to ask you, but that's okay. As you were talking, I was thinking about the difference between somebody telling you what to do and you making a mindful choice for yourself. And of course, both of us, when we talk about, I think generally is the basis for anything we would do in terms of coaching around food, we would be emphasizing the importance of mindful choice as opposed to being told what to do. And I really think that's the big difference. And I know intuitive eating is different from mindful eating, and you can speak to that, but mindfulness has to be a piece of anything sustainable. If you're not choosing it for yourself, if someone is telling you what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat, how can that be a sustainable set of habits for you if it's not conscious, mindful decision making?
And it requires too much work to be sustainable.
Yeah.
If you're constantly having to think about food, what to eat, how to prepare it, how much of it to eat, when to stop, it's not sustainable, because eating is a bit of a habit in many ways, right? So for many of us, our behaviors around eating are habits. So, do you eat sitting down or do you eat standing up? Do you eat at a table or do you eat at a desk? Do you immediately grab your phone on the way to the table so that you're scrolling through your phone as you're eating? Do you grab breakfast standing in the kitchen while doing other things? Do you stop and pause before you eat? So a lot of our habits around eating take away from the experience of it. And, one of the key principles of intuitive eating is satisfaction. And the satisfaction factor is the foundation in that we deserve to experience pleasure while eating. Eating is something that we have to do multiple times a day, every day of our life, and it should be enjoyable. It shouldn't just be about nutritionism, which is, what food group does this come from? Is it high in protein? Does it have this vitamin? Does it have, that nutrient? It needs to be about, what do I want to feel nourished in this moment? And that answer is going to change every day, right? But
Right.
if you have a toolbox, if you have a basket of meals and foods that you enjoy, that you can prepare, that you have access to, that, fit your family's needs in the moment, and nourish your physical and mental health, that's what we're trying to build with intuitive eating,
Right.
right? And we're trying to build the tools to know, when am I hungry, when am I full, but most importantly, what do I need to feel satisfied from this meal? And if you have followed a plan, there's a novelty factor that's there for the first few days, maybe a couple of weeks, where you feel excited about the potential changes, like you're dreaming what life on Mars is going to be like. But then you realize that it's not pleasurable, that the meals aren't satisfying, right?
Right. And this podcast is going to air, Jen, at exactly that time point for most women
Perfect.
who made a resolution around food. And that's why I wanted to do this podcast. This was actually not in my podcast schedule. I had this moment at the beginning of January. I thought I haven't got a food related, diet related podcast in my January lineup, and I need to do that. So Jen graciously agreed to do one kind of last minute with me. But I wanted to have this air right at the time. So it's going to be air like around kind of 3 weeks into January, when most people have reached that point where it's not, the novelty's worn off and it's now become
Yeah.
hard. And probably if you're listening to this podcast and you made some resolution around food and or your eating habits, you are probably have now had at least one day where things have not gone the way they were, and I'm putting this in air quotes, supposed to go. So you haven't actually followed whatever that plan is. And my guess is that has already led to you feeling like a failure. And that has pushed you into that shame and blame cycle. And that's what I want to talk about next, because I think this is one of the main reasons, Jen, why these programs fail. And it's also, I think, from a harm perspective, one of, if not the biggest harm that the diet culture perpetrates is this shame and blame cycle, and what that does to women in terms of their psyches and their mental health. So why don't you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I mean, often, well, so the shame and blame really comes from this diet culture belief that we only require enough motivation and enough willpower. And when you no longer want to follow the food rule that you've been given, it's immediately like, well, you didn't want it badly enough. You didn't try hard enough, right? And going back to that whole idea that control creates compulsion, if you think about any diet that anyone's been on, right? So let's use keto, for example. So keto promises that, you're never going to crave sugar because you're going to have all these fats and your body's going to be satisfied by that. And, Bob's your uncle and you're done. Except 10 days into keto, or maybe before that, an apple looks so delicious, right? All the fruits that any other plan or most of the other plans would allow you to have kind of free reign now become like this, this
The forbidden
golden
fruit.
apple.
Literally
Yeah,
the forbidden fruit.
literally
Yeah.
the forbidden fruit, right? If you're on a low fat program, then cheese is your forbidden fruit. So the forbidden fruit changes depending on what you're trying to control. And that's because we're hardwired to avoid pain and seek pleasure. And, it's not you, it's them. Your body is just yelling at you, is saying, this is not comfortable. This is not pleasurable. This is not helping me. I'm going to find a way to get you to stop this one way or the other. It has nothing to do with willpower. It has nothing to do with motivation. It has everything to do with your body telling you this is not sustainable.
Right. And I think I love that, Jen. Thanks for explaining it that way. I think that's a really great way to talk about that shame and blame cycle. And I see this play out in exactly the same way in relation to alcohol with the women that I work with around alcohol. There's the shame and blame cycle is the reason why people can't get out of it. And so one of
Yeah.
the things that I advocate in my practice around alcohol is that people really start trying to shift into an experiment mindset. And this comes directly from Annie Grace, who's my mentor. And it's the certification that I have is through This Naked Mind, which is Annie's organization. And she wrote the book on this. But it's this idea of really getting into experiment mode and starting to ask really pay attention to what makes you feel good? What doesn't make you feel good? How did it feel when you did this? How does it
Yeah.
feel when you didn't do this? What is it that you actually, this is my favorite question, Jen, what do you actually need? In
Yeah.
the moment, what do I need? And sometimes in the moment you need food because you're starving. That's very
Yeah.
often the
Absolutely.
answer, right? I need food. I am hungry. I need food. And then the next question is, okay, what kind of food do I need right now? You know?
Yeah.
Um, and if it's a moment of true, pure celebration and food is part of that celebration, then sometimes what you need is food. That's maybe not
Yeah.
that healthy, objectively most healthy food. But this idea of asking yourself what you need, getting into experiment mode. And the second, so I think that's important when it comes to the intuitive eating thing. But the other piece that I think pulls nicely, over from the This Naked Mind model around alcohol to food is this idea of trying always to extend self-grace to yourself.
Mhm.
So always trying to give yourself the same grace that you would give somebody else. And we're
Yes.
terrible at that. We are so terrible at that as women,
Yeah.
especially. I think we just get into this habit of not ever doing that. But it's amazing what happens when you commit to that, to
Yeah.
saying, like, I'm in experiment mode here. I don't know how this is going to go. I'm just paying attention. I'm learning from all of these experiences that I have. How did I feel when I was doing that? How did I feel after that? How did I feel the next day? What if I do it differently? How does that make me feel after? How does that make me feel the
Yeah.
next day? And starting to build habits that way.
All of the women that I work with, I work 99% of them are coming to me because they no longer feel like they have an internal compass that's working to help them figure out what feels good, what they like, what they want, because they have so many food rules that are now all mixed up in their head. Right. I can't count the number of people who have come in and said, like, I'm here because I literally don't know if I'm allowed to eat fruit. Is fruit bad for me? Or, people coming in and saying, like, I now have anxiety if I'm served a meal with carbohydrates because I feel like I've ruined my day. Like, there are, people are like, I'm overthinking how much of something I can have without it having an effect on the scale. So what I really try and do is approach that curiosity in a really similar way, which I think is such a nice, it takes the pressure off, right? Jessie Harold has used the saying, a series of tiny experiments is how she approached a lot of her changes. And I've always really resonated with that you don't have to commit to the outcome. You just have to show up to try something different and see how that feels. And so when we're talking about what to eat and how much to eat, we need to focus on what does comfortable hunger feel like? What does hunger feel like? Because if you've been dieting your whole life, chances are your hunger cues go from starving to not hungry at all. So we're trying to figure out what comfortable hunger is. We want to figure out, okay, well, what does comfortable fullness feel like? And if you believe and know that you have unconditional permission to eat anytime, you can stop when you're comfortably full, right? You're not worried about how much longer before I can eat again, or is this the last time I can eat for the next 16 hours, right? Like, it's craziness, right? And so at the end of the day, we're trying to kind of weave together this hunger and fullness, compass, along with what do you need to feel satisfied? And so when people are afraid of bringing foods back in, when they're afraid of kind of maybe reintroducing carbohydrates that they haven't had with permission for years, we'll talk about, well, how much do you think you would need to feel satisfied to try? Like, what would be an okay amount to try and just see? And I'll tell you a funny story. Somebody the other week was telling me that they hadn't had carbohydrates before noon for like at least 5 years. They'd read this thing, or it was part of some plan at some point, that you should never have carbohydrates before lunch. And so they were getting up and they were having protein shake, their eggs or whatever. And come lunchtime, they were starving. And then they would end up kind of eating all day and kind of at night eating. But so I said, okay, series of experiments. What was your favorite carbohydrate back in the day when you were having carbohydrates? And I said, I really love an everything bagel with butter. That was always like my favorite breakfast. And I said, great, let's try that on. She sent me an email the next day and she said that she had so much energy and mental focus from having carbohydrates in the morning that she felt like she was on speed. So so not only was she getting the physical nourishment from it, but it gave her so much pleasure and satisfaction that she carried that the whole day, just by honoring what her body enjoyed and needed and wanted in that moment. Right.
Yeah.
So the change in how we live when we are honoring what our body wants and needs compared to what we think it needs based on someone else's food rules is like magic. Right.
Yeah, and also I have to assume, Jen. Well, I mean, I don't even have to assume because it's this is how I live in relation to food. And again, this carries over from the coaching work I do around alcohol with my clients. I have to assume that the mental space that you free up as a result of moving from, a like extreme rule-based program to intuitive eating is just incredible.
Yeah, it's literally life-changing.
Yeah.
So many women, especially in midlife, spend probably more than 50% of their day thinking about or worrying about food.
Yeah. What did
right?
what did I just eat? Was it good? Was it bad? What am I eating next? Is that going to be good? Is that going to be bad? That dialogue is going on in many of the women that I work with. That's been going on in their heads now for 40 years. And it's just constant. They can't even imagine what it would be like to have peace from that. And then if you add the alcohol piece in, which many of my clients have both, we tend to go to different coping mechanisms for the same underlying discord, whatever that is. But so many of the women that I work with also have like half of their day consumed by, what did I drink last night? Was it too much? Should I have done that? What am I going to do today? When am I going to drink? Am I not going to drink? How much am I going to drink today? All of these rules that we set for ourselves. And I certainly see it in the alcohol sphere. And I'm sure you see it in the food sphere, that when you're able to take that away, that mental chatter, you're able to achieve some freedom from alcohol or some freedom from food, which is my goal. My goal is freedom from alcohol with my clients. And I know your goal is freedom from food noise. With your clients. It must just be feel so liberating and really
it really is life-changing, because people will say that they would, in their kind of before life, would spend so much time meal planning, and meal planning can be part of gentle nutrition. There can be a lot of positive habits and healthy behaviors that come out of meal planning. But when your meal planning is down to the like ounce and down to the grams, and you're constantly kind of juggling calories or food groups or macros to make things fit, that's not healthy, right? And that's not peaceful. So if you can just be like, okay, we're having this meal tonight and I'm going to have enough for leftovers tomorrow, and I'll grab something out of the fridge for breakfast. It's like 3 seconds of your life.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I hear you on that. Cause it's a double-edged sword, things like meal planning. And, I totally am as I'm a massive fan of meal planning. I think it's amazing. It's changing.
Me too.
And I think what we need to ask ourselves is, whatever the behavior is that's going on around food, how does it make me feel and how does it make me behave? So the answer is, it makes me feel amazing because I don't have to think about food the next day, and it makes me behave in a really positive way because I eat healthy food and I feel good about that food and I don't have any like mental chatter about food. Great. But if the answer is, when you get honest about it, the answer is, it causes incredible anxiety because I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to stick to this plan, or I'm not going to be able to do the thing that I'm planning for myself. Or it makes me feel deprived, which causes me to eat things just because I feel so deprived, right? So it's leading to that kind of dissonance in your brain. Then I think the answer is, well, this is probably not the type of meal planning that's actually good for you. And you've got to find the type. And I'm such a fan of like flexibility with meal planning. Some people plan just the next day. Some people plan for the entire next week. But what I have never been a fan of is planning for breakfast, lunch, dinner, both snacks and definitely not a fan of the portion, the portion size planning and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So as with everything, there is a spectrum with this. And I think when you're looking at your underlying behaviors, you need to ask yourself, how is this behavior making me feel and how is it making me behave? Is it positive overall?
Yeah.
Jen, I just added this question in because I thought of it as we were talking. I hope you're okay with it. But
Yeah.
I have a teenage daughter, and I know you have two.
Mhm.
Are they both teenagers now? Your two girls?
Teen and preteen.
And preteen. So I just wanted to ask you, if you're comfortable answering it, what advice would you give to moms out there who are
Mhm.
listening to this podcast and thinking, "Ooh, I feel like that's been me," which is probably most of the people listening to this podcast. Again, we've all fallen into this diet culture because it's all that's out there. We don't have a choice,
Yeah.
or we feel like we don't have a choice. What would you say to somebody listening to this thinking, "Oh, I'm wondering, I'm worried that maybe I'm perpetrating a cycle here at home"? How do we talk to our girls about food and body image, and bring in intuitive eating principles into that, so have that be a positive
Yeah.
decision?
Yeah. I mean, I hope that if my kids were to quote me 20 years from now, it would be that I always say bodies come in all shapes and sizes, and um, so we try and be body neutral, right? Because we are 5 people in our family. We all look differently. We have different genetics. My kids see a lot of similarities, for example, with me and my sister. And backstory, long story short, is that I didn't know about this sister until a couple of years ago, and we're kind of carbon copies of each other physically, right?
Yes, you are. I've
Um,
seen the pictures. They look identical. It's crazy.
And even just the other day, like literally last weekend, my daughter sat down on the couch next to my sister and thought it was me, turned around and said, "Mom." you know? So so there's that for them to be able to see, and they can certainly see, like one of my daughters, looks like my mother-in-law. And so I think it's important to talk about bodies and shapes in all sizes, being part of the normal human experience, right? Just like eye color can be different and shoe size is different and skin tone is different. This is just another way that we experience diversity, is in body shape and size. And trying as hard as you can to limit exposure to any media that places value on one size or shape, right? So, and that's harder, right? And so kind of having that dialogue and discussion when it comes up, when the opportunity comes up. One of the questions that I often get from moms of teens is, I feel like my daughter has seen me dieting for so many years. And I didn't realize that I was so vocal about it, feeling guilty for always eating something differently, or feeling guilty for not wanting to be in a picture, and now it's like, now this memory wheel is coming up for them. And so I think that depending on the age of the child, I think there can be some discussion around body acceptance and saying, and having an open discussion about it. I'm a big fan of open honesty. But even just practicing body neutrality, right? That's a really safe first step for people who are trying to go from feeling like their body's not good enough and trying to move into a more body positive sphere, is just kind of body neutrality. This is the body I have. This is, I have big feet, and I have, and those feet take me places, but they're not good or bad. They're just feet, right? Really, and trying to model that, because at the end of the day, as it's so much less about what you say and more about what you do. And so that, if your kids see you practicing body acceptance and see you eating intuitively, and so, our kids, we try and give them as much freedom as we can about, when to eat within the confines of, this is when we're eating, but you don't have to finish your plate. We'll leave it on the table for you if you feel like you're full and maybe you want to come back to it later. We try and engage everyone in meal planning, like, okay, what would you like? What would you like? So that we're all getting a turn and feeling like our needs and wants are satisfied. And we just talk a lot about, are you hungry? What does that feel like? Oh, did you get too hungry? Maybe next time we'll work on having a snack before you do this. So it's just a lot of modeling, I think, is really what we can shoot for.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Thanks for that. So we we had talked about in the last podcast, we talked a lot about perimenopause. That was really the focus of the podcast,
Mm,
intuitive eating, but in connection with, your work in working with women in perimenopause and menopause, which is my demographic as well. And of course, Sarah Bailey's been on this podcast many times now, and we talk specifically about a lot of the concerns and challenges that women have in perimenopause and menopause. I just want to touch on with you the
yeah.
role of hormones in our weight as we age.
Yeah. So bodies change, right? So that's kind of the first thing that we need to accept is that just like in puberty and just like in pregnancy, bodies are meant to change and our bodies do change. Women who are going through perimenopause on average gain somewhere between 10 and 15 pounds. That's true for 80+% of women. So it's physiologically normal. That likely has to do with estrogen. So in those early perimenopausal years, estrogen actually rises and estrogen promotes fat storage. So women in perimenopause can store fat at twice the rate that they build muscle. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying to build muscle because that actually promotes your health later in life. But it means that you're going to be fighting biology if you're trying to control the size and shape of what your body looks like on the outside. And the reason that our body does this is probably to protect us later in menopause when we aren't making as much estrogen because fatty tissue can make estrogen.
Right.
So there's this kind of beautiful, symphony of hormone changes that happen that we're not told about. So many women feel like they're doing something wrong. There are memes and, 8,000 different people selling plans out there for women over 40 without acknowledging that, okay, how can we work with your body
Right.
so that you are healthy and feeling well, so that when you come through on the other side, your body can just return to or adopt the size and shape that it feels comfortable with. And so, because we know that dieting predicts weight gain, so, the more you gain and lose weight, the more likely you are to gain more next time. It doesn't serve women to aggressively try and lose weight in their 40s, because chances are they're going to actually end up weighing more than they would have if they had just focused on health and not the scale.
Yeah, that's great. I always say that nobody yo-yos up, everybody yo-yo. I mean, nobody yo-yos down, everybody
Yeah,
yo-yos up.
exactly.
Um,
I
and
love that.
and I've certainly I think I don't know, Jen, if you've been listening to the podcast episodes, I have been very
Oh,
I've been very honest in what's going on with me. I am now in full menopause. I am not in perimenopause anymore, and I definitely have noticed a change in my body in the last, especially I'm going to say in the last 6 months. It's been incredible how much it's changed. And I have to say, if I'd not had the conversation with you and Sarah Bailey that I've had about the fact that my body, by holding fat in different areas, is trying to keep me sane because
yeah.
I have been losing my sanity, as many of the listeners know, in terms, especially in relation to my sleep, which has been just a mess for the last 7 or 8 months. I now, I have this little, I've had a shift, and Sarah said it. She's like, it's not always a weight gain. Sometimes it's like a shift where your body's just holding things in different places. And so the shift for me has been into my abdomen, which has, I'm sorry, I just have to say, I've always had a pretty great belly, and it just disappeared this year. And now I've got
Yeah.
this little, I've got this little pot there, but now I call it my menopot, and I kind of rub it like a Buddha belly. And I say, thank you very much, because I think it's actually, responsible for creating whatever limited levels of estrogen I have now. Those fat cells are doing their best to produce
Yeah.
that estrogen that I desperately need right now because my estrogen's so low, right? So I have found that explanation super
Here's
liberal.
another one for you. Instead of calling it a spare tire, call it a life preserver.
Ooh, I love that too. That's what
Yeah.
that's what I'm going to start doing. That's a great way to describe it. Because it is really interesting. I've been thinking a lot about this lately. Our bodies, it's just incredible when you shift your perspective from hating your body and just beating up on your body to actually getting really curious, again in that experiment mode, but curious about it, what's happening inside my body right now.
Yeah.
And this understanding of, okay, well, I am no longer making the levels of estrogen and all the other hormones, sex hormones I'm just not making them anymore like I used to. And my body is doing its best to figure out how to get me balanced again. I will take this little Buddha belly, and I will love it because it might be the thing that gets me sleeping again. Right.
Yeah.
That's how I've been looking at it over the last 7 months.
Love it.
Yeah, I mean, it takes work. I'm not going to lie. It's not easy for that. I still
No,
have
no.
I have all the same cognitive dissonance that everybody listening to this podcast has, but you
Yep.
can change that. You can reduce that cognitive dissonance. The
Yeah.
first step is getting aware of the fact that it's there. And that's really what this podcast hopefully is going to do for women. On that note, for the women listening to this podcast who started a diet at the beginning of whatever that diet was, you're following some set of rules around food at the beginning of January as a New Year's resolution. What advice do you have for them?
So, I mean, this is always a challenging thing because, there isn't a one size fits all answer. But if what you're doing isn't working for you, meaning that you've had to keep trying new things, you're constantly living by the number on the scale dictates whether you have a good day or a bad day. It dictates what you participate in your life and what you don't participate in. um, there is just another way, and intuitive eating is such a beautiful framework to help women move away from diet culture with the safety net of support, right? So often I think women, we feel like we can do it all, right? Like, oh, I can do this, I've got this, I'm done with dieting, I'm going to jump on the diet culture bandwagon. But there's a really big messy middle that happens between food obsession and food freedom. And if you don't have a framework, if you don't have the support of people supporting you in your life, but also professionally, working with people who are trained to help you get through the messy middle, then you can just keep getting pulled back to diet culture. So kind of someone who can hold your hand through the scary parts, because there is a lot of fear moving away from doing the thing that you've always done, even if it's not working, right? It's that cognitive dissonance of, okay, this doesn't feel good, but it's all I know. And if all I know is not liking my body, not loving my body, feeling like there's something wrong and that I have to do something different, and all I know is to look to a plan or a set of rules, then you need a guide. And so I always joke that I'm people Sherpa as they move away from diet culture to food freedom.
Yeah, I love that. So it's incredible, Jen, as we're talking the ties with alcohol here, because that's exactly what I would say I do as well. I never thought of it
Yeah.
as the messy middle, but the messy middle is kind of my middle name. That's
Yeah.
that's what I do as well
Yeah.
during the day. And you're right. I mean, it's really very helpful to have somebody to help guide you through that. So I would say to those women who are listening to this podcast, be kind to yourself and
Yes.
ask yourself how this thing you're doing is making you feel and how it's making you behave, and get super honest with yourself about that. Really honest, is it really serving you? And if the
Yeah.
answer is no, let it go. For the love of God, let it go. And I think, when I listen to Jen talk about intuitive eating, I always think of it as like you coming home to yourself and actually figuring out for yourself what works for you, instead of having somebody else tell you what works for you.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm right on that, Jen, but that's how I think about intuitive eating.
Yeah. And because there is no one size fits all answer, right? Um, and so often we have these thoughts that come up because they're part of our unconscious beliefs that, I have to change my body, or I have to do this to be healthy, or I should want this, or I shouldn't want this. And just because it's a thought doesn't mean you have to believe it. You don't have to act on it just because it comes bubbling up. And I think that that's where a lot of times we get scared, because we believe that we have to follow a plan. We believe that if we're not constantly working towards, a weight goal or a health goal, that there's something wrong with us.
Yeah. Thanks, Jen. The last thing I kind of want to talk about, Jen, because I know there are going to be people listening to this program feeling very confidently like they need to make some changes. So,
Yeah.
and listen, I believe in your intuition in that regard. I believe if you feel like the way you're eating is not serving you, it's not making you feel good, it's not both physically and mentally, I absolutely think that you should be thinking about making changes. And so what I wanted to talk about before we close off is for anybody who's listening to the podcast thinking, look, but I need to make changes. I know what I'm doing is
Mhm.
it's not it. I'm not in the right place with food. I wanted to talk about this idea of how we characterize and set goals, and the difference between setting goals from a place of deprivation versus goals from a place of abundance and
Yeah.
abundance and freedom. And this is something that I do in the sphere of alcohol, and I know that this is part of what you do as well as an intuitive eating coach. So what I mean by that is that there's a big difference between setting, in relation to food, for example, saying I'm not going to eat any carbohydrates, or I'm going to cut out all sugar or all gluten or all dairy or all meat or whatever the thing is. There's a difference between setting a goal like that requires deprivation. It takes things away from you, versus setting a goal that is like, look, I feel like I'm probably not eating enough plants. I want to increase the amount of plants that I eat. I'm going to work on eating more servings of fruits and vegetables every day. Or I'm feeling like I'm not drinking enough water. I'm just not hydrated enough. I'm going to work on including more water in my diet. Can you speak to that, the difference between kind of taking away versus adding,
Yeah.
in terms of changes and goals, and what
Yeah.
recommendations you might make to people out there trying, knowing they need to make change, but wanting to do it in a more positive, healthy way?
So when change comes from a place of, if you've been told that you need to, let's say, you know, eat in a better way or eat more conventionally healthy, let's say, for example, like you're pre-diabetic or diabetes runs in your family and you're trying to make some changes. The conventional diet culture message is less sugar, less carbohydrates. And again, in in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with saying those things, but it's the fact that one, if you enjoy them and you like them and your brain knows that you like them, taking them away makes you feel deprived. So on the flip side, why don't we just not say we're going to take something out and let's focus on adding in fruits, vegetables, and fiber. Let's focus on adding in movement without making any changes to the sugar and the carbohydrates. Let's start by adding in and seeing if the result of that is positive enough to become self-reinforcing. And so when we're talking about changing habits like that, this January, I've been running a non-diet resolution group. And what we've been talking about is habit change, because the science of habit change is really kind of how we can change those automatic thoughts, because habits are shortcuts that our brain takes. And if your shortcut has been to choose XYZ and you want to make it ABC, it's not enough just to want it. You have to have a plan in place. And so being able to kind of set an implementation statement like, okay, I want to eat more fruits and vegetables, so I'm going to take them from the fridge and put them on the counter. Or I'm going to set the apples next to the milk that I reach for 3 times a day in the fridge, and really focusing on what you're doing instead of what you're choosing. So, how you're doing something versus what you're doing. So, I think that takes a lot of the pressure off of perfection. So it helps, it helps people, and mainly women that I work with, but it helps us to kind of focus on what we want the outcome to be, which is we want to add something to our life and we want to gain something versus we wanted to take something away. Because you can't hate yourself into a body that you love, and you can't deprive yourself and expect joy as a result.
Yeah, we know that from science. I mean, science is really
Yeah.
clear on this. We need, we have far more success with making change when we are, when the goal that we have set for ourselves is a goal that actually feels amazing. So it's a goal that gives us something instead of a goal that takes
Yeah.
something away, right? It's the same thing with drinking. You can say to yourself, I can't drink. I can never drink again. Or you can say, I'm going to create this. I'm going to create freedom. I deserve freedom from this. I'm never going to, I'm going to be in this place where I'm going to have complete freedom about this, from this thing. And it's not going to continue taking away from me day by day. And I think that exactly the same thing works with food. And there's also a component of, when you set a goal, does the goal need to be like, I always talk about the difference between a quantitative and a qualitative goal. So we tend to set quantitative goals. We're really good at that. So I'm going to only eat this much food, for example, or only have intake this many calories, or I'm going to lose, my goal is to lose 10 pounds, as opposed to a goal that is more qualitative, which is more reflective of how you want to feel. So how are you going to feel if you make these changes? So I want to feel freedom. I want to feel abundance. I want to feel nourished. I want to feel energized. I want to feel, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
and I think that that's an important piece of any change that you make, being able to sustain it and maintain it, right? And that's the difference between having a purely weight-based goal, which, even if the number on the scale changes, what you're doing to get there doesn't necessarily feel good and sustainable. And so it becomes harder and harder to convince yourself that it's worth doing.
well, and if the number on the scale is the only motivation for you, once you've hit that number, where's the
What
motivation?
next?
So I've always used that and it's when I've been coaching around food, I've always used that as a really important determinant in how you set your goals. I always say to people, I want you to be doing this for 5,000 reasons other than the number on the scale. Because if you're not doing it for all the other reasons, how it makes you feel, your energy levels, disease prevention, mental health, all of that stuff, then when you get to that goal number, you've got no reason to keep doing what you're doing.
And weight loss does not protect you from a negative self-image. So often women, that's their main goal, is they want to feel better about their body. And I think that that's a great goal, but it's like looking for love in all the wrong places, right? And you're not going to find it in a number.
Yeah. That's so great. Jenn, thank you so much for agreeing to do this last minute. As I said, I really appreciate your flexibility on it. I think the timeliness of this podcast is going to be spot on for a lot of my listeners. So I appreciate everything that you shared with us today. I know that you are now, you have an active intuitive eating coaching practice. And when we were chatting before the podcast, you said you're still, at this point, you still have some room. And so you are accepting, I don't know how you do that, but maybe you can explain what people can do if they want to get in touch with you.
Yeah, so the best place to kind of keep tabs on what I'm doing is through Instagram. So at menopause.nutritionist will always, the link in my bio will always be up to date. But if anyone's interested in exploring my intuitive eating coaching, you can go to intuitivenutrition.ca and find out about my coaching programs.
Awesome. And I'll include that in the show notes as well. Thanks again, Jenn. It's been awesome.
Thanks, Wendy.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a burnout and balance coach, I help busy high achievers like you create a more balanced, joyful life. To be sure you don't miss any upcoming bite-sized conversations, subscribe now to this podcast. For more balance and wellness tips or to connect with me, visit my website at wendymccallum.com. That's WENDYMCCALLUM.com.